prominent in the research throughout is that we also are able to differentiate between how people identify themselves and what positions do they hold on issues that are considered in the realm of religion and state. So more and more and more and more Israelis will now support civil marriage, with that having nothing to do with the way that they self-identify as more traditional, less traditional, more secular, less secular. And a lot of the issues that were once referred to as part of the status quo and part of like a necessary, we must have that in order to have a Jewish state, are pretty much thrown off the window.
Like what?
Like the fact that unless you come to Israel in the next week, then starting next year, you'll have, you're okay?
Your microphone's on
Your
your
mic,
jacket.
yeah.
Adam, can you?
You're okay? So starting next year, which I hope will bring you all to Israel, you will have public transportation in Tel Aviv and in Gush Dan, run by city council. Yeah, that's a very good thing.
Yes.
Yeah, we're done with the mic? Great. Good. I will repeat. Thanks. So as I was saying, unless you will be in Israel in the next month, which I guess at least some of you will not, starting 2020, you will have public transportation in Tel Aviv on Shabbat. And not Tel Aviv, really just Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv and Givatayim and Ramat HaSharon, Herzliya. A lot of the Gush Dan municipalities have decided to fund that by themselves. And we understand that more, and I will say, by the way, that as I see it, that is not privatization, okay? A city council level, as I see it, is not a private level. And more and more and more of the things that one were sort of described as the keystone to what it actually means to be Jewish and democratic are just not acceptable by the majority of Israelis anymore. And we're seeing a very strong liberal trend. You don't agree?
No.
Okay. And I think that mainly we need to remember that a lot of the things that were sort of once understood, okay, you can't really civically married in Israel, you can't get civically married in Israel, so what, you'll go to Cyprus and that's not okay. The generation that I'm part of and the younger generations are saying, no, I won't do that. I will marry in Israel, I will marry at home. And the numbers that the Rabbinate is publishing are really...
Not the Rabbinate, this is a law from the land.
No, the Rabbinate, okay, so now I will need to correct. The Rabbinate at the beginning of 2019 published numbers. They published a number saying that 6.2% decrease in the number of Israelis marrying, Jewish Israelis marrying in the Rabbinate. Okay, that has been consistent for more than a decade. The numbers, again, I think are undebatable, mainly because I'm not talking about polling. Polling is also very, very positive. But those are actual numbers of people who are just marrying outside of the Rabbinate. And I think that in every aspect that we see in the Israeli public opinion, it is trending much more liberal on religion and state issues.
So it's kind of funny thinking about this. Three Israelis arguing with each other. Is this working now? Yeah. In front of one bunch of very, very engaged American Jews. Just thinking about the situation.
Lots of Israelis. Lots of Israelis.
Israeli, okay, whatever. Anyway, I'm usually in the academic framework, but I'm going to be a little bit confrontational because I think that I think what Uri is describing is something that we call in Israel Medinat Tel Aviv. And
The state of Tel Aviv.
The state of Tel Aviv, which is the central area, which is predominantly dominated politically, governmentally, and even populationally by people of Ashkenazi sort of secular, etc. And that actually speaks to a gap, an internal gap within Israel, which want to think about in terms of this distinction between American encompass the sovereignty factor. So I want to do something, just a simple sort of exercise in thinking. Who has more in common? And obviously, it's just a question to get us to think. Who has more in common? The Hasidic young man from Bnei Brak and the Hasidic young man from Borough Park, or the Hasidic young man from Bnei Brak and the Russian, not halachically Jewish young man of the age of 18 that he sits on the bench next to at the draft board at Tel HaShomer at the age of 16, 17, because they both...
The Bnei Brak guy.
Excuse me. Okay, so I'll correct you. First of all, we want to talk about rises in Haredi army service, but everybody goes to the draft board. Those who get an exemption still have to sit on the same bench, take the same psycho tests, take whatever they call them, do the same interviews, they go through the entire process, and at the end, those who get an exemption. But what I'm trying to describe is a universal experience, it's a universal experience that is particular to Israelis. That a Jew living in another part of the world, unless they volunteer for the Israeli army, does not have any sense of what that means. And that's a type of sovereign experience. It's not about these highfalutin ideas of government and state, religion, etc. It's just kiyum, existence. What does it mean to know that when you're age 16 or 17, you will get that card at home and you will have that chavaya, that experience? So, as a father of 6 children who have all men and women, I have a daughter who's finishing her training and starting to serve in 2 weeks, and my older daughter served, and my sons, etc. The experience that they describe, they communicate to me in terms of what does it mean to be a part of that broad spectrum and population and engage with them through those types of encounters, is one that it's very hard for me to communicate when I teach my American foreign students or when I speak at venues throughout the United States. And I think that is a way, it's an instrument or a portal for thinking about the distinctive natures of these societies. And again, my goal is not to limit it to what's different, but it's when we establish those differences and we acknowledge them, when we think about them, clearly we don't deny them. How can we then go further and say, what does allow for navigating a discourse which is positive and not just causes divisions?
I think you've been talking now about socio-political identification rather than Jewish identification, what you've just described. I don't want to make a false distinction.
Okay, that's the point.
Yes.
That in Israel, religion and socio-political identification cannot be pulled apart in the way when you live as a minority in a Christian country or in a pluralistic country that you can, and that's the starting point. Thank you.
And Ruth, you actually spoke to that this morning when you said that in America, we're talking about American Jewry rather than the world diaspora. In America, Jews who wish to be more part of society, and at the time, 140 years ago, were could say that their Judaism is a faith rather than their ethnicity or their peoplehood. And could you respond to some of what Adam just said there?
I think the two perspectives,
To speak into your mic.
the two perspectives are different, but they are complementary. And this is part, I think, of the fascination of the Israeli situation. Okay, I got it. I'm going to hold it. Fine. So it's true that in Israel, people of very different attitudes to religion live together, work together, sometimes go to school together, not as much as they did in my generation, where we're really they're more different schooling places to live in, etc. But it's true that there are some shared experiences. You lose friends in terrorist activities, and you lose them whenever, from whatever group in the population you come from. And this is very important. But I think we are asking something that is completely different here, not completely different. And this is, assuming that this is the case, and this is indeed one of the strengths of Israel as a Jewish state, that no one of these groups is not a stakeholder in Israel as a Jewish state. The question is, what should be the norms governing the lives of Israeli Jews? I'm not talking about the Arabs, not because they're not important, but because we are talking about state and religion for Jews, okay? So the question is, assuming that you would like to marry, or your children would like to marry, clearly they're going to choose to marry according to Jewish law, and this is fine, and they can do it here, and they can do it in Israel, and they should be able to do it in Israel. But when my son wants to get married, he's not observant. Why should he be made to only get married by Jewish halachic law? And the answer is, as we just heard, he doesn't have to do it because the Israeli system has vaults of ventilation. We have a legal monopoly of Orthodox Jewish law and Muslim Christian law on marriage and divorce in Israel for all Israelis. But people who resent this find ways of working around it. And the ways around it are ways that are themselves constitutionalized in social norms and in judicial-made norms and in some legal norms. So in fact, it's a symbolic thing that you cannot marry in Israel, for instance, if you want to marry a non-Jew. But for all purposes, two people who want to live together as married couples can do that in Israel, both same-sex and not same-sex, to an extent almost unrecognized in our region, but also in many Western democracies. So life in Israel is much more powerful than the limiting law. Now, yes, in Tel Aviv, we're going to have public transportation on Shabbat. This is great, should have happened a long time ago. But civil marriage is not going to change. It's true that a majority of Jews, including Orthodox Jews, would like to have civil marriage in Israel and don't think that it's incompatible with a Jewish state. But they cannot translate their preference to the political system. I have an organization called Metzila. It's a center for Jewish, Zionist, liberal, and humanist thought. And we do position papers. And we wrote, a couple of years ago, a position paper on marriage and divorce written by two Orthodox people who argued for civil marriage just the way Gavison Medan, this covenant that I did with a Jewish settler rabbi, Orthodox rabbi, on state and religion issues in Israel. We recommended there to be civil marriage. We recommended the American system. The state gives license, you go and choose how you want to get married. I don't think it has any chance of politically being enacted in Israel despite the liberal rise and despite the kind of what we are seeing now. What we are seeing now is Bibi, not Bibi. We are not seeing a willingness to give up on a political alliance with the ultra-religious parties. We're not seeing that at all. And if they are part of the government, they use their veto power on that for their own reasons. I think it's a mistake on their part. So we want to distinguish whether what are we going to have, what can we fight for, what does it mean in terms of the Jewishness of Israel. And I suggest that we look less at the laws and more at the reality. And I think that in terms of the reality, not the symbolic reality, which I also find very offensive, but in terms of the real reality of the quality of lives of people who want to not have to live their lives under religious norms that they do not accept, I think that secular, non-observant Jews in Israel are free to do that in Israel in an increasing way. So this is not a real issue. It's, as far as I'm concerned, this is another symbolic issue, and we should decide whether we want to work on the symbolic issues, which are harder to solve, or whether we want to find on the real issues that limit the ability of people to do real things in their life.
I think that not everyone on this panel would agree that the lack of civil marriage in Israel is a symbolic issue. And I wonder if Ori would care to address that.
Yeah,
And is there any, is it written in stone in terms of Israel being a Jewish state, that it must be controlled by the Orthodox rabbinate?
So of course not. I think that if you were a Russian-speaking Israeli, born in a country that would not allow him to marry, but will allow him to get killed in battle, you would have thought that that might be a little less symbolic. I think that if you were an LGBT person, born in a country that will allow him to be killed in action, but not to get married, you will also think that it would be less symbolic. And I think that what we're seeing, and you alluded earlier to the Medinat Tel Aviv, I guess some of you have heard the name Zohar. It's a group of probably 20 years ago were considered liberal rabbis that started a thing in which they were marrying people next to the Rabbanut, maybe, which we now call Rabbanut with a smile, because they are registered in the Rabbanut, we need to say that. But their latest entrepreneurship is handing out kashrut certificates outside of the Rabbanut. And we need to understand that that's happening because it's not a Tel Aviv state thing. It's happening because the majority of Israelis reject the idea that a small minority, and I think that by that we also need to understand that our dear president who also gave a blessing to this conference, I think confused a lot of Jews around the world with the Four Tribes speech. The Four Tribes speech is very interesting, I think very inspirational, lacks a lot of demographics, which is also important if we want to discuss politics. And the four tribes he described are sort of a description of the Israeli educational systems. Okay, we have 4 different educational systems. Okay, we have what we call in Hebrew, and for lack of a better word, we'll use secular. It's mamlachti. It's not really state. It's sort of the kingdom, maybe.
The public.
Right.
Secular public.
Secular public, religious public, ultra-Orthodox, semi-public, and Arab. And he sort of, right, mostly public. And he sort of said that will be pretty much 4/4 of the Israeli population in a few years. The demographics aren't going in that direction. And I think that we need to understand, and we are seeing that a lot of those things that are progressing are not because of people who believe that those are just symbolic things. We saw thousands of people marching the streets because it changes legislation that said who has the authority to authorize the grocery store to open on Shabbat. That's a stupid thing, okay? We can accept that. Who holds the authority to say if the grocery store does or doesn't open? And we saw mayors who were nearly overthrown for that. So I do think that, by and large, the Israeli public is not taking that as sort of a symbolic idea. I do agree that it's becoming much easier, both on a legal and on the fact that how society treats that, to just say, I will not marry in the Rabbanut, and I do not really care what the law says. And we shouldn't accept that as sort of a long-term vision.
I'd like to take a couple of questions, if we could, and then move to closing comments and remarks. So we'll take these 2 first. Yes, ma'am?
So could you speak to the fact that if you do reject religion or your Jewishness in Israel, there is no alternative but Orthodox. So what's happened to the conservative movement, the reform movement, so that people can choose on a spectrum what they'd like to be as Jews?
Let's take your question as well at the same time.
I'm hoping Professor Gavison can take a few minutes and describe the role that the Supreme Court plays in defining the Jewishness of the state and what its self-imposed
You want to take that one first? Only if you want to. You don't have to.
Okay. When you have very, very difficult issues,
Speak in the mic.
when a society has very difficult issues, very often the decision is not only what is the right way to go, what is the right solution here, but also the decision of who decides and how. So on what the right decision is, not only myself as a secular, non-observant person agree with most of what Uri will say, but Gavison Meidan, which is a covenant between a very Orthodox rabbi and myself, agree that the state of Israel shouldn't do what it presently does, as an idea of what should be the case. But you're referring to a different question, which is very important, and the question is, who decides these issues? And I think, only answer that can be given in a very complex democracy like the one we have is, you do it through either the courts or preferably, and it's very controversial, through the legislature. And this indeed has been the case, and this is why I think that despite everything that Ari said, which is correct, the chances that the Israeli Knesset will legislate civil marriage is, as far as I can see, very slim. So I'm glad that you can, work around this. That's it. So now we go back to the court. I said you can do it either through the Knesset or through the court. And the courts usually have been much more secular leaning than the general population and the Knesset. And this is why there is a tendency on some issues, not all, despite the fact that the court doesn't really want to go there, to drag the court into making decisions on state and religion. So there is the Kotel controversy, the conversion controversy, some gay rights cases, all kinds of cases, some public transportation cases, all kinds of cases that go to the court. Sometimes the court says, non-justiciable, I don't want to do it. Sometimes the courts does something that is acceptable. And at times, the courts uses the rhetoric of rights in a way that is problematic to some parts of Israeli society, and that sometimes creates a legislative backlash. The most important example is still 1970, when the Supreme Court said that they should register as a Jew a child of a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother, and the Knesset, as a response, amended the law of return and said that the definition of a Jew under the law of return is almost halakhic. I don't want to go into that. It's fascinating, but too complex for now, okay? So in Gavison Meidan, we in fact addressed this question. And what we said was that it's better for the courts and for Israeli society as a whole to decide that these issues should not be litigated in the courts in terms of rights. Is it true that the women of the world has a right to pray in the Kotel as they do? Or do we want to treat the Kotel as an Orthodox synagogue so they don't have a right to do it there but can do it elsewhere? These are important cultural questions, but they're not legal questions, and it's not a good idea to have them decided in terms of rights by unelected judges who are suspected to not be reflective sufficiently of the sensitivity to religious life. So I think that it's healthy for the State of Israel. It's not demanded by any theory. It's healthy for the State of Israel to prefer to see these very important debates as debates that shouldn't be decided by courts as not as application of laws, but as, general descriptions of rights. Religious pluralism you have in Israel. You have non-Orthodox streams in Israel. But as my colleague Shlomo Avineri often says, for the majority of non-observant Jews, the synagogue they don't attend is an Orthodox synagogue. So there is a democratic problem with the representation of non-Orthodox streams, which here seem to be part of Jewish religiosity, and in Israel are usually politically coupled with the non-observant. Theologically, it's not very coherent, but in terms of the sociology, it's what happens.
You need your mic.
Elaine. So I felt a lot of pain when you asked that question, and it's something that I experience often with friends who are active, not people who are detached from their Jewish life, but people who are active in Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, post-denominational community congregations, and it's very painful, very hard. And I can understand why, if that is existential to a person, looking at the state of Israel, the Jewish state, and saying they don't accept certain basic definitions for what I am as a Jew is extraordinarily difficult. I am not going to whitewash that. That is a reality. Campaign, political change, all sorts of things are possible. But in the current situation, I don't see it changing on a macro, governmental, etc. level. On the level of the ground, there are really interesting things going on. I thought it was really profound that Uri was really representing the pluralist approach here, and as an activist, the example that he gave of change was Zohar.
Because you said that it's a Tel Aviv thing.
Zohar is liberal, open-minded, like Beit Hillel, there are all these organizations, and he didn't say Gilad Kariv and Reform Movement, etc. And to me, I don't know if that's what you intended, but I read it as, gee, he's saying, that is not going to be the way things are going to move. And that's extraordinarily disenfranchising on an individual level. But returning to the theme that I've tried to express throughout this session, you've got to acknowledge the difference. And as long as we try to make our Jewish existences in our own country the ones that we expectationally want to have in Israel, we're going to lose. We're just going to lose because we're just going to be alienated. We're just going to feel pushed out. We're just going to feel that we don't have a connection. And but if we can move beyond that, and that's a hard thing, but that's where we have to be breaking our heads now. It's too easy just to say the rabbinate is terrible, just to say that non-Orthodox denominations don't have the same acceptance. That's terrible. It's horrible. And I'm not being patronizing. I believe it's horrible. But this is a distinction between these places. If we feel that Israel is an important thing for us beyond those issues, how are we going to make it work for us? That's what we have to be doing here.
So can I follow up on it? So the reason I gave an Orthodox example is because you referred to the Tel Aviv state. And from what we're seeing, with all due respect, everything that happens in the Tel Aviv state that you described happened in the ultra and Orthodox spaces a decade later. So this is what's happening with Tzohar. Tzohar is now doing what Gilad Karib did a decade ago. And it took them a while. And now, after they tried and they bounced their head against the wall, and Rabbi Stav wanted to be the chief rabbi, was kicked off the stairs. So now he performs services outside of the rabbinate. I will tell you the truth, in a decade he will do it in marriage. It will happen. There are Orthodox groups now doing marriages outside of the rabbinate. It takes a while. It probably brings in a much higher price within the Orthodox community to do that, unlike my community. And I want to answer, I totally agree with Professor Gavison about the places of the courts. I think that that's the wrong place to fight. But I want to say that I totally agree with what you said about looking at Israeli Judaism through the lenses of denominational streams is missing the point. That's something that I think should have a very strong standing in Israel, but I just don't think that that's the way to examine it. I think that there are a lot of progress happening in different non-denominational options existing in Israel, and I think that that will probably bring also a contribution to the acceptance of the streams, which is vital. Not, again, forgive me for saying that here, not to please American Jews, because it's important to people who live in Israel, and also because it's your homeland. And if we want that to be the homeland of Jews, we need to accept everyone who's Jewish in their own way. I just believe that that will happen through things that are more daily on an average Israeli's personal life, and not sort of on a higher level discussion that will probably happen later.
Let's take one more question. There was one. Yes, ma'am.
One of the questions you had under the description was...
We ignored the description, but go ahead.
Okay, but I want to ask the question anyway. About American Jews, the right of American Jews to criticize and talk about Israel. How do you feel about that?
As the editor of a Jewish newspaper, I do it all the time. With love as an Israeli citizen.
Can I say something?
Yes.
I think that you need, that happens. Okay? American Jews play a role in the Israeli public system, political system, call it whatever you want, through very different leverages that people do it. Sometimes they do it after they sort of thought, is it in our place? I think that that's a discussion mostly happening among my liberal friends. And some of them, let's take one example, Sheldon Adelson, puts $1 billion shekels in a newspaper, $1 billion shekels over a decade, and influences the Israeli society. I think that if American Jews care, and I think that the majority care, and I think that you are a part of what I see as the Jewish homeland, then you need to acknowledge the fact that the game is being played. You can sit in the sidelines and it's fine. But it happens. American activists in different levels are active in the field, some through philanthropy, some through politics, some through civil society, some make aliyah, whatever. And I think that all of those options are viable. And I think that if we want to be the homeland of the Jewish people, then you have skin in the game.
So I just want to say that I totally encourage it on a personal level. I think every Jew throughout the world should be engaged and has every right to express their opinion if they accept the fact that there's a legitimacy to having a Jewish national homeland. If they undermine the very concept of a state of Israel, democratic, etc., but if they don't believe that the basic structure is legitimate, then the criticism isn't productive. It's really destructive. I think there's a book that it came out in Israel in September in the spring. It's going to come out soon in English, but I would strongly recommend people to read, not because I think people will agree with it, but in this particular audience, I think it'll be provocative in a fascinating way. There's a professor of political science at Tel Aviv University, Yossi Shein, who wrote a book. It came out in Hebrew. It's called Hamea Yisraelit HaYisraelizatzia Shel HaYadut. The Israeli century, the Israelization of Judaism. And the reason his argument is interesting is because he does a side pass, an end around the idea of this distancing theory, the idea that Jews in North America are becoming alienated from Israel. And his argument is even the people who are the biggest critics, or many of the people who are the biggest critics, people like Michael Chabon or some of the writings that Jonathan Safran Foer and other people have expressed, they're doing it because Israel is the most central, most provocative, most important factor in what it means to be a Jew in the 21st century. It's not, do I like Israel or don't I like Israel? It's, what is the thing that we get passionate about? What is the thing that we get angry about? What is the thing that really, does it for us. It's not denominations for most of us anymore. It may be religion of another way, but certainly the Israel thing really gets to our kishkas. And thinking about that as a way to actually look at even hypercriticism as being positive engagement, I think it could be very helpful for our current realities.
I want to be respectful of our time and also give Ruth the last word. And if you'd like to leave us with a thought.
Okay, I think this is a good conclusion, because I think that there is a difference between the right to criticize, as far as I'm concerned, unlimited. The right to claim the right to influence is different, and I think there are more interesting limits. I think there is a difference between AIPAC that says, we are for the government of Israel, whatever it says, because we are on the government level, Israel versus the United States. J Street comes in and says, no, we're not just the government of Israel. We sometimes are critical about the government of Israel, but that's still pro-Israel, and we would like to have a right, an institutional, constitutional right to say, I think this is clearly legitimate, important, and fine. The last question is, do American Jews have a right to not only influence, not only criticize institutionally, but also decide? On this, I think that Israeli democracy is all and only Israel's citizens, irrespective of religion, nation, all and only citizens. People who want to be citizens can influence. People who choose, totally legitimate and important for Jewish life, to choose to have their Jewish life elsewhere, can criticize, can be engaged, can hate, can do whatever they want. Maybe this is an interesting issue, but I think that their expectation that they should have a privileged place in deciding the issues is misplaced, because Israel is a Jewish state, but is also a democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our panelists, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Sue.